Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I will speak about climate change and the current and future impacts on the living collection and the garden landscapes of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. The living collection of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, is cultivated across 4 gardens, and if you're not exactly sure where Scotland is, if you look at the middle bottom slide, the red arrow, that is Scotland, a tiny island out in the North Atlantic. So the 4 gardens we have are Benmore, Edinburgh, Logan and Doik. I'll say a little bit more about the climatic conditions there just shortly. But the scale of the living collection across the 4 gardens is 344 families, 2,721 genera, 13,750 species, approximately 130,000 plants. And of these 13,750 species, about approximately 60% are what we call wild collected, 32% are verified, and we cultivate plants from over 163 countries. So the climatic conditions of each of the gardens, so within 150 kilometres, the climatic conditions of each of the gardens are significantly different and allow us to grow this fantastic range of plants. So Benmore in the west is the wettest, with approximately 2,600 millimetres of rainfall. Edinburgh is the driest, but with an increasing rainfall or average rainfall of 636 millimetres. Doik is both the coldest and the warmest. So the coldest is -20 centigrade and the warmest is +30 centigrade. And Logan is the mildest, where winter frosts are quite unusual, and the absolute minimum in the winter of the last winter was -1 centigrade. So it's quite important to record the weather, and we have meteorological recording stations across all 4 gardens. And in Inverleith, we have a UK meteorological agency, the Met Office standard weather station, and in that we record maximum temperature, minimum temperature, grass minimum temperature, 10 centimetre soil temperature, 30 centimetre soil temperature, 100 centimetre soil temperature, and rainfall. And we also have a rainfall gauge from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and that is available not just to ourselves in real time, but to the public, and that is very important and useful for ourselves for monitoring rainfall patterns in the garden. So the garden at Inverleith, this is an aerial shot of the garden, looking at our glasshouse range, which are currently closed for refurbish. But we have a diverse range of glasshouses dating from the 1834. That's this glasshouse here. That's our tropical palm house, our temperate palm house, constructed in 1858. And this was at its time, a very modern range of glasshouses with external support structures, maximising growing space, constructed in the 1960s. And then we have an array of research glasshouses here constructed in the 1970s. So what are the climate change issues that affect all 4 gardens? So in recent years, we've had severe winds over 75 kilometres an hour. They are happening more frequently throughout the year, not just over the winter months, but also in the spring and summer. Cold and seasonal cold weather with early and late air frosts and infrequent prolonged winters causing damage to plants. Rainfall, we are having more rainfall extremes. Last year we recorded our wettest single-hour rainfall event. We're having drier springs like we've experiencing just now, or drier summers, wetter summers, above average winter rainfall throughout the year, and these more intense rainfall events throughout the year. Heat, this has not been a problem until very recently, and this year's been a good example. We've seen a gradual increase in temperature. Long-term planning, or we're expecting long-range forecast for increased heat in many of our gardens. And then the key for us for all these issues to long-term planning to have the right plant in the right garden and location within each garden. So cultivation challenges the wind. So the picture in the top left was a particularly severe wind event that we had in 2012. It was a sting jet that caused considerable damage to the garden. But they're not just happening in the winter months, they're happening more frequently throughout the year, in the spring, the summer, and the autumn. And when plants, particularly deciduous trees in full leaf, this can cause increasing amounts of damage, particularly to the trees. The scale and the extent of the devastation can be quite immense. We can have damage to infrastructure, buildings, glasshouses, the gardens are closed, and then that causes additional costs in terms of loss of income. So these are just a few examples of wind damage that you can see both in the winter on the right-hand side in January 2012, the two pictures, and then in May, this was the same time, if you're familiar with the Chelsea Flower Show, this was the same week as the Chelsea Flower Show, so it was a beautiful day in London, and it was a horrendous day in Edinburgh. And this is some of the infrastructure damage. This is the big storm that we had in January 2012. And it caused significant damage to our glasshouses and caused us to very seriously rethink how we were going to be able to grow plants under glass going forward. And as a result of that, we've just started on a very large restoration program of our glasshouses. So you can see glass loss on the outside and inside the glasshouses, a considerable amount of damage to the living collection. And then just to give you an idea of the scale, at Benmore, we have trees that are maybe over 100 years old, almost 150 years old, and you can see the damage. I don't know if you can see the small figure in the middle of the screen here and the size of the trees. And these trees have just been snapped off anywhere from 6 feet to 12 feet in the ground. And as you can see in this picture here, these are immense trees. They're approximately, or can be anywhere up to 50 meters long. So you can see the damage that it caused. We're blocking roads and crushing other plants underneath them. Rainfall, cultivation challenges. We're having more rainfall extremes over the year. The drier springs that I've mentioned, the wetter summers, autumns. Above average winter rainfall can make work very difficult when the ground gets saturated. These more intense rainfall events throughout the year. Last year we had 54 millimeters in 1 hour that we recorded in our rain gauge, and we reckon that's the single biggest rainfall event we've ever had. And then as you can probably see in some of these pictures, problems associated with a fluctuating water table. We have to then reduce the compaction. And again, we need to make sure that we're growing the right plant in the right place to make sure it survives. To combat both extremes, we're using mulches to conserve water. We're having to install irrigation, but at the same time we're needing to ensure our drains are more effective, and we're using drainage schemes, and I'll come back to that just a little bit later on, and then obviously rainwater harvesting as well. And then what are the impacts of the significant rainfall in the surrounding area surrounding the gardens and within the gardens? Flooding's an obvious. There is a path underneath this picture here at Inverleith. The little river or stream that runs through Benmore can reach epic proportions and destroy bridges, as can the River Tweed here at Doik, which bursts its banks and flows the road leading to the garden. And these are the typical winter storms that we get, and in this case it was in September. So these severe weather events are happening all the year round, and I think that's one of the key things with climate change, that the frequency of these events throughout the year, and we get these low depressions tracking in off the North Atlantic, causing significant damage to us. And then on a more practical level, what have we had to do? This path runoff, our paths are not really designed for rainfall events of over 25 millimeters in an hour, so we're having to install drains, resurface paths, and then the other primary reason for doing this as well, this picture here where you have standing water, does then predispose some of these plants, particularly rhododendrons, to some of the soil-borne pathogens, and I'll mention that slightly later on. Cold, severe winters, the picture on the left-hand side. This is a very wintry picture taken in the winter of 2009-10. We had two winters back-to-back that were perhaps two of the coldest winters in living memory, and by Scottish standards, where we had sort of almost reaching minus 20 degrees centigrade. So that what we have seen is a result loss of tender plants. That's plants that have probably been tried outside for maybe 10, 15 years, and then we get these very severe winters. Obvious damage to infrastructure, freezing pipes, and damage to buildings. Obviously, if we're growing plants under glass, we've got additional heating costs, And then we've obviously got additional costs in keeping the garden open. So this is a good example of some of the plants that suffered in cold or have suffered in cold winters. This is one of the Southern Hemisphere tree ferns that we've tried outside in Edinburgh quite successfully for a number of years. There was a check in their growth after these two particularly bad winters. And then just a general view of some of the issues regarding severe winter. You've got the costs in keeping paths open. You've got it's a very picturesque scene in the gardens, but obviously it can be quite challenging as well to work. And these events are quite unusual. This was probably the greatest amount of snow recorded in Edinburgh in over 50 years. But at least some of our visitors did enjoy the wintry scene and the weather. So it is quite unusual for Edinburgh, but it can cause significant problems and costs. What is perhaps happening more frequently are these unseasonal changes in the temperatures. So we have a very mild spring that can start in January, February, and then we get very late unseasonal frosts, and this can cause damage to plants in bloom, like these rhododendrons. It can defoliate deciduous trees like this Terracaria, as you can see in the middle two pictures. And then also, as you can see here, even azaleas, which flower a bit later in Edinburgh, April, May, it can cause them significant damage as well. So we're having milder winters, warmer summers, and these fluctuating temperatures can cause challenges and problems to plants, but particularly when they're in flower. And these extremes of weather can be experienced almost at any time of the year. We're not expecting extended periods of hot weather over 30 degrees, but I think by the time we get to 2050 and certainly 2080, I think they will become more frequent. So we need to start planning for that now. Heat and prolonged dry weather. What are the consequences? This year was probably a very good example of some of the challenges we've faced. We've had prolonged dry weather, higher than normal temperatures. Plants begin to suffer. Irrigation is required at cost. Visitor numbers, however, increase until the temperature gets above 25 degrees, because we're not really used to that in Scotland. And then extended periods of hot weather, again, as I say, I think we need to be planning for that for 2050 and certainly by 2080. So some of the challenges that we've had with climate change not just relate to the plants in the garden landscapes, but also with the number of new pests and diseases that we're picking up. And these are inextricably linked to some of the climate change challenges. So we've seen a considerable increase in new plant health issues. And these have had they do have the potential to cause severe difficulties to the cultivation of plants within the living collection. So the key contributing factors are climate change and the global movement of plants. Obviously, post-Brexit, that's probably not as much of an issue. But the key to control, other than prevention, is making sure the staff are fully briefed, there is horizon scanning, and an interception at source where possible. So some of the plant health issues that we've had or are experiencing just now: ash dieback, horse chestnut leaf miner. This is an emerging one. Emerald ash borer. This is one that's been intercepted in the UK. Citrus longhorn beetle. Phytophthora morum is an issue. These are examples of other phytophthora. So this is Ostracedra and cedar, and here as well. But again, the key is making sure that the staff are fully briefed on what are these emerging threats and issues. And this one here is one that we're looking for just now. This is Xylella fastidiosa, that is a particular problem on an increasingly large range of plants. The other thing that we need to be aware of and mindful as a botanic garden, we have a responsibility. We cultivated a huge range of plants, and we know invasive non-native species are a global problem. We have some very good bad examples in the UK of plants that become invasive. So we've got giant hogweed, Japanese knotweed, the Pontiac rhododendron, skunk cabbage from North America, and the Gunnera manicata from South America, and the Himalayan impatiens. So horizon scanning, being aware of what these changes in climate are like and how they are likely to affect emerging invasive non-native species, is something that we are actively involved in. So in Scotland, we have very good targets in terms of target date of 2045 to be net zero. And that's significantly better than many other countries, including the UK, the rest of the UK. There's an interim target of a 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 relative to the 1990 levels of carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, and the 1995 levels of hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride. Further interim targets are set for reductions of at least 56% by 2020 and 90% by 2040, again relative to the 1995 baseline. However, the energy generation from renewable sources show that in 2020, almost 96% of the electricity consumption in Scotland came from renewables. By 2030, Scotland aims to generate 50% of Scotland's overall energy consumption from renewable sources. And by 2050, the aim is to have decarbonised our energy system almost completely. These are very ambitious targets, but are achievable. But there are obviously issues in meeting these challenges as well. So what have we been doing in the garden towards environmental sustainability and reducing our carbon emissions? We've introduced micro-hydro schemes at one of our gardens at Doig. We have air source heat pumps at Logan, heating our small conservatory glasshouse that's open to visitors. And at Doig, we have a biomass boiler powered by wood chip, local wood chip, to heat the buildings and the hot water. Other environmental awareness schemes that we've been involved in, obviously the key one in Scotland has been the reduction in peat in our growing media, which is a big issue. We've been exploring innovative technology from renewable sources like these robotic mowers. This particular one has travelled over, as you can see in the figure on the right-hand side from the app, has travelled almost 13,500 kilometres, perhaps enough to travel overland from Scotland to Korea. We're experimenting with new growing techniques, this use of the air pot system, which is made from recycled plastic in Scotland, increasing the use of biological control in our glasshouse systems to make our not just a more effective control of pests, but also a more pleasant environment for staff, and then decarbonising our use of machinery where and when possible. We've experimented with the robotic mowers and then moved on to hand tools, and we're now using vehicles for transporting staff and materials around the garden as well. So that's a very active programme that we've got just now. But as I mentioned earlier, the total annual rainfall recorded in Edinburgh has been increasing gradually over a long period of time, as you can see in this chart. So there has been a trend upwards since we started recording records. That's almost over 2 generations. And what one of the solutions was, well, you can see in this picture here at the top left, we had a very wet area of the garden, and working closely with colleagues at one of the local universities, we developed what we call the rain garden, and that is really a more attractive way of dealing with this perennial problem of saturated soil. So by changing the soil composition, adding materials, we've also changed the planting composition as well and made it a far more attractive, as you can probably see in this picture on the right-hand side, and also in this bottom left-hand picture as well. So this is a very sensible use of a nature-based solution to a particular problem with climate change. The other thing that we have done is we're very aware as well that linked with climate change there is significant biodiversity loss, and what we've working with other organisations in Edinburgh, we have come up with this concept of the living lawn, and that's a more biodiverse sward that's more attractive to pollinators, but also doesn't require as frequent mowing and cultivation. So just by careful selection of species, we can increase the biodiverse content of the area, of the meadow or the lawn area. We don't cut it as frequently, and it's more drought and stress tolerant as well. So this is the living lawn in the garden. I firmly believe that horticulturists have the skills and knowledge to help combat these two biggest challenges humankind currently faces: climate change and significant biodiversity loss. We need to change and adapt our work practices to make sure that in horticulture, we are minimising our impact on the planet and be more sustainable. I think it's also important that we transfer our skills and knowledge to the next generation. So RBGE, our education programme, really goes from pre-nursery right through to PhD to then on to vocational qualifications as well. And that broad breadth of educational opportunities also gives us an opportunity to transfer our knowledge to the next generation and those of our visitors who are interested in the work and how they can help meet these two big challenges for humankind. Looking to the future, horticultural staff at RBGE have proven adept at coping with the aftermath of some of these weather extremes that I've shown you. We have a greater need to anticipate potential future problems. We need to horizon scan for trends and threats and utilising the best available information in the short, medium and longer term. We need to ensure that key staff have the best available information, and information exchange and gathering within the UK, European and obviously this meeting today are very important. We need to have greater environmental sustainability. We need to reduce our carbon footprint, and then going slightly further ahead in the medium to longer term, our planting plans need to have inbuilt future resilience, including climate mapping, what we expect the temperature and the climate to be in Scotland in 2050, 2080 and possibly beyond. Just finishing with a few pictures of the four gardens of RBGE. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy the seminar.